Hi, welcome to Start with MTSS, Engaging All Learners. My name is Stephanie Dyer. I am a school psychologist by training and a BCBA, and I have worked with START, which is Statewide Autism Resources and Training, on and off as a contract person for about the last 15 years, but I am now full-time with that project. I have also spent the last 10 years on staff with the MiMTSS TA Center. So kind of bringing both of those lenses together today for this session. So the purpose of today's session is to equip educators to increase academic and social engagement of students with ASD and other diverse learners. And by the end of this session, I hope to have helped you identify some foundational beliefs that may impact having an MTSS framework that truly supports all students, and be able to describe some of the universal supports that promote academic and social engagement of diverse learners. So let's get started. I first want to just give you a little bit of information about what START is, to give you some context for this session. So START is another grant-funded initiative similar to the MiMTSS TA Center, Michigan Alliance for Families, AltShift, for example, and they're funded partially by the Michigan Department of Education. So START's mission is really to work with schools and community partners and families to support students with autism spectrum disorder, to allow everyone around to really help embrace the diversity and provide any needed supports. And so we have some core values that you can see in the lower left of your screen. The project is really about building capacity, so this knowledge and skills of trainers and coaches around the state, again, to help provide the best supports possible in schools. Another core value is around inclusion and really fostering communities and schools in which there is a sense of belonging for everyone. Collaboration is another core value, as is use of evidence-based practice. So on the right side of your screen, you see some of the activities that we engage in as a project. We provide training and coaching, technical assistance. We work through regional collaborative networks to really, again, foster collaboration and coordination across districts, community stakeholders, families, etc. Part of our role is dissemination of evidence-based intervention, development of resources and tools that are available to be accessed both through the START website as well as in trainings, conferences, etc. And then lastly, to use and promote the use of evidence-based practices and having evidence-based decision-making. So the START website is at the top. It is gvsu.edu/autism center. Okay, so to get us started, one of the mantras that we have in START, we have things that we call START isms that are sort of these little phrases that stick with people that help reinforce really key concepts. And so one of these is this: all decisions and practices should align with the law, the research, and the data. And so this means that when we're making decisions about educational and social programming for a student or system level decisions, that we want to select those things that fit within the law, the research, and the data versus sort of just I think, I feel. This just shows the regional collaborative networks that I mentioned, and I'm showing this because all of you who are viewing, if you're in Michigan, you are in a region that has START representation. So each of the colors that you see here represents a region, and each region has the same set of priorities. Every region is working on providing professional development with impact, meaning that they are growing local trainers to be able to provide training to people in their region. They're establishing a coaching structure and coaching practices to implement those evidence-based practices for students with autism and other diverse learners. And there's priorities around implementation of peer-to-peer support, which I'll talk more about as we go, and then also priority areas around family and community engagement. So if you have any interest in learning more about what's happening in your region, if you go to the START website and click on RCN for Regional Collaborative Network, you will find contacts for each of the regions. All right, I'm gonna start with a quick activity, and if you could just find a scrap paper, something near you, and just draw that triangle, that MTSS triangle. And then here's what I would like you to do, is I would like you, with T's, I'd like you to put, where are your students with trauma? With B's, where are your students with behavioral challenges? With an EXR, where are your students with excellent reading skills? And then IEP for where are your students with IEPs? So I'm actually going to do 60 seconds. 90 was too long yesterday. So 60 seconds to go ahead and code your triangle in that way. Okay, so I am going to, since I can't see your triangles, I am going to operate as if you were very similar to the group yesterday. And what we found is that T's representing students with experience with trauma were all over the triangle. B's were all over the triangle. Excellent readers tended to be more at the base or that tier 1 level, and then students with IEPs were closer to the top of the triangle. And so this exercise is really just to kind of reflect our thinking and our experience around tiered support. And so what we know is that there are no tier 3 students. There are no green zone, yellow zone students. What we describe is the need. So I might be a student who has a behavior support plan. I might be a student receiving a tier 2 reading intervention. And what we know about most students, maybe all students, is that no one is needing that level of support at all times. So we all have things that we're very competent in. We all have things that we could use extra support in. If you're like me, I have things that I need a lot of extra support in. And so it's based on our support that we're receiving for a specific need, not just in general. So we should see those triangles with all of these codes all over, because an excellent reader may be receiving more intensive support for a social or behavioral need. But in reading, they're certainly not needing that extra support. Okay, so what about those students with IEPs? This is always a question. So we have this triangle here where we can see that most, all students are getting the same, like they're getting core instruction, they're getting universal instruction, high yield behavioral strategies, again, are being applied to all students at that universal tier 1 level. Some students are getting more of that targeted support in academics, like let's say reading and or behavior, and some students are getting that more intensive level, a more individualized level in academics or in behavior. So again, what about students with IEPs? Let's go ahead and take a look at that. So what we know is that tier 3 is inclusive of students with and without disabilities. Tier 3 is not only for students with an IEP. It does not exclude students with an IEP. It's certainly not a place. Tier 2 and Tier 1 are also inclusive of students with and without disabilities. So you're like, what? Like students with IEPs are in all parts of the triangle? Yes. So what we know from IDEA is that students are first and foremost general education students. So all interventions and supports that are available to students in your school are also available to students with an IEP. So if we look at this triangle again, and we've got our Tier 1, our Tier 2, our Tier 3, we do not have a separate triangle that represents students with disabilities. We don't have a floating kind of triangle over here that represents students that have IEPs. We don't have like a dark red at the very tippy top of the triangle that represents students with IEPs. Here's where students with IEPs are represented, the whole triangle. What we know is the purpose of an IEP is to outline those supports and services that allow that student to access and make progress in gen ed. So again, they're first and foremost general education students. Some general education students have an IEP that provides, again, an outline of those supports and services that allow them to access and make progress in general ed. So with that said, that IEP is going to overlay everything that we do in that whole triangle. All right, so if we have a student who, let's say we have a student with autism who has an IEP predominantly for social competency type of goals, and let's say he's a fourth grader, and our fourth graders receive, benchmark screening assessments, and we find that this student shows a need for a Tier 2 intervention. Does this student have to receive that intervention through special education since they have an IEP, or can they receive that intervention with the other fourth graders, who need a Tier 2 reading intervention? And the answer is they can attend that reading intervention group with the other fourth graders who need that reading intervention. Unless it is in their IEP, they are able to access that reading intervention. And they may not need to get the reading intervention through specially designed instruction. They may be able to just access it through the reading intervention being provided to the other students in their grade. All right, with that said, I'm just going to go to the bottom bullet for a second. If a student does have an IEP, all the special education programs and services that are outlined in that IEP must continue. So we're not certainly going to say, oh, well, we're going to pull you out of getting your reading intervention in the resource room and now put you in this reading intervention. We have to hold true to the IEP. However, the next time that we are looking at that IEP, we can have that conversation about where that student's needs may be best met. Okay, this first bullet is a quote from a letter from the Office of Special Ed at the federal level to talk about MTSS in terms of allowing all students to benefit. So it says a multi-tiered instructional framework, MTSS, is a school-wide approach that addresses the needs of all students, including struggling learners and students with disabilities. And it integrates assessment and intervention within a multi-level instructional and behavioral system, again, MTSS, to maximize student achievement and reduce problem behaviors. So it's very clear that MTSS is intended to be for all students. One way that helps me remember this is to not say special education student any longer, but rather I say student with an IEP. And that helps me remember that they're first and foremost a student in this school, and they happen to have an IEP for certain things in order to allow them to be successful. Okay, so with that said, some of this requires a shift in focus. And the first shift in focus that I'm going to propose is that we focus on student engagement versus just stop it, like stop the behavior, right? I have been there, I have done that, it does not work. I'm sure that many of you have. And so when we shift our focus on student achievement, student engagement, instead of stopping behavior, it changes the strategies we use, it changes our interaction with that student, it changes our focus. So we have this mantra, and I am going to say it to you and then ask you to say it again with me. Absence of behavior is not the goal. Engagement is the goal. So say it with me. Absence of behavior is not the goal. Engagement is the goal. Engaged students are learning. And again, this shifts our focus from trying to stop behavior to actually implementing strategies, doing things that are increasing that engagement for that student. So I want to propose one more shift in focus, and that is, again, focusing on student engagement versus fixing students. So engaged students are learning new skills. And these are skills on the left that can impact student engagement positively or negatively. So you see things like organization. That having strong organizational skills or not so strong organizational skills can impact student engagement in the classroom. Whether or not I understand the expectations can impact my engagement in the classroom. My ability to communicate or to engage in social reciprocity with others can impact my engagement in the classroom. So we have skills that can positively promote student engagement or can maybe impede student engagement a bit. We have to recognize that. But on the right side of the screen, we also have strategies that support student engagement. So you can see having structured, organized classrooms can promote student engagement. Having PBIS, having those expectations and classroom routines that are taught and practiced and acknowledged can increase student engagement. Having a student have a communication system so that they can engage in the classroom obviously supports student engagement in the classroom. And you can see those 7 dark blue circles around student engagement. All of these things are found on a tool that is in the Dropbox folder called the C to R. And you will see these 7 domains and very specific descriptions of ways that we can support and implement strategies in each of these domains. So for example, adult support and interaction has 4 different things that we can work on, measure, track to help us increase student engagement in the classroom. All right, I'm going to give you an example of why this increasing engagement is so much more important than fixing. Personal example, not even a great one, but I think it helps. So I went foaling a few days ago. So for those of you who don't know, foaling is where you are bowling, but you're throwing a football. You don't have a bowling ball, you're throwing the football. And so I am in an environment with people around me that have played football most of their lives. I am very immersed in football. I understand football. However, I cannot throw a football very well at all. I've seen it done. I've seen it modeled. I've had people try to help me. I just cannot do it. I stink at that. Now, when we went to the foaling lanes, I was also with people who were not very good at throwing the football. Did that stop us from having fun and engaging in foaling that night? No. Here's why. We didn't go and have somebody say, oh, you don't have the skill level yet to engage in the lane. So you need to go over here and we're going to work with you until your throwing is good enough that now you can join in this foaling game. We didn't have that happen. They said, here's what you do. Here's the rules. Like, have a good time. So we jumped in. And what we found is that we were not very successful. We also found ways that we could adjust and adapt and put some supports in place so that we could still engage and still have fun with this. So for example, the line that we were standing at, that we were supposed to stand behind to throw the football, we moved it up for all of us. So now we were able to be a little more successful. Still not great at hitting the pins with the ball, so we modified our throw. There was no rule that said you had to throw it like however you're supposed to throw it. We threw it sort of underhand, and that was really fun and let us engage. We also discovered that many times we were not hitting anything but the floor, and that the bounce of the football sometimes knocked down the pins. So we found all kinds of ways to engage in that activity. We had a wonderful time. We were connected, we had fun, we were engaged, and yet we didn't have the skill that really was required to play that game well. And so for me, as I was doing that this last weekend, I was thinking, this is what we're talking about. How do we put strategies in place to allow students to engage? Because you know what? We were learning as we were doing this, and students will learn as they're engaged. So how do we create conditions? How do we put strategies in place that allow a student to engage, even if they might not have the skill to engage in the same way as others? All right, so that brings us to talking really briefly about some of the law. Remember I said we're going to talk about we make our decisions and talk about practices based on the law, the research, and the data. So we're going to talk briefly about the law, and one of the two very foundational concepts in IDEA obligations is FAPE. So if I ask you what FAPE is, most of you will say it's free, appropriate public education. But what does that really mean? And so we know free means it's at no cost. We know public means that it's provided, by public funds and it's public school, open to anyone. And we know that education is, education. So it's appropriate is usually the one that throws us. And appropriate here is really talking about that individualization. So what is FAPE? And in the rule, it's defined as special education and related services. So what does that mean? Again, we just kind of get into the language to figure this out. Special education and related services is defined as specially designed instruction. Lots of you have heard that. So what is that? Well, by the rule, by the language of the law, it says it means it's adapting the content, the methodology, or the delivery of instruction. So we're adapting pieces of curriculum. We're adapting how we're teaching. We're adapting the way in which we're delivering instruction. Those are all considered specially designed instruction. Doesn't necessarily mean a pull-out situation. It can also happen within the course of the general ed classroom. So why? Why have special education and related services, specially designed instruction, adaptation of the content, methodology, or delivery? Why? Because what we are obligated to do is to address the unique needs of the student resulting from their disability. So what about the student's autism is the question, for example. And the second part is we're addressing those unique needs in order for that student to access and make progress in general education. So what about the student's autism is impacting their access to general education. And when we address that, that is FAPE. It's getting at those needs related to the disability that are impeding their access to or their progress in general education. Okay, so the next thing, the next really big foundational requirement and concept in IDEA is least restrictive environment. So I'm going to start just by reading the federal definition here at the top because this matters for all of the strategies we're going to talk about in a minute. So what the rule says is, to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated in the general education classroom with children who are not disabled. So what I find in my experience and some of my colleagues is that we hear people say maximum extent possible. And possible seems to conjure like a sense of, well, if we had the right staff, or if we have the right program, or if we have room, if we have extra hands on deck, then we could educate this child in general education. But the rule says maximum extent appropriate. And so how is that defined? Well, let's go on and look at the second half of that law, or that part of the rule. It says, and that special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from regular ed occurs only if the nature and severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So the emphasis here, and really the least restrictive environment, is predicated on our implementation of solid, robust supplementary aids and services. Those things that might move the dial for that student to allow them to really be able to make progress on their IEP goals in that general education environment. And so I don't know about you, but in my experience, I have many times seen those supplementary aids and services in the IEP, and I used to write them as well, like more time on test, preferential seating. And so if a student needs those, absolutely. But we wrote those pretty routinely. And I would argue that those supplementary aids and services moved the dial for any student to set conditions up where they were able to more readily access and make progress in general education. So MDE, Office of Special Ed, has some really good guidance documents, very easy to read, short guidance documents on many pieces of the IEP process. One is around these supplementary aids and services. And so they have summarized some of the rules around this, and you can see on the left that what we are supposed to do is include those supplementary aids and services that are based on peer-reviewed research as much as practicable. And that it does include modifications, accommodations, and supports for school personnel that allow students to access and make progress in gen ed, extracurriculars, etc. So what does it mean, peer-reviewed research? And over here on the right is where I'm going to get to these evidence-based practices. So this is where, in that supplementary aids and services, we start thinking about what are those evidence-based practices that we can put in place that are going to allow the student to maximize their time spent in general education in front of that general education instruction. And so you can see these should be probably really familiar to you. Visual and organizational supports, functional communication systems, peer-to-peer support, PBIS and behavior plans, etc. So we have to get really good at these things, because without implementing these things well, students are being more restricted from general education than they might otherwise be. Okay, so when we think about the spirit of the law being that students are being educated alongside their peers without disabilities, what does the research say? We've talked about the law. Let's talk about some of the research. So this could be a very long section, and I'm just going to give you some of the highlights and very much a summary, as well as this list of resources and references is not all inclusive. But when inclusion is done well, that means more than just putting a student in a setting and like waiting for magic, like really supporting and putting those good supports in place. Student academic and social behavioral outcomes can be improved. And we know from some really key studies that getting core instruction within general education makes a significant difference. That where students are getting that instruction matters hugely for outcomes. And I want to just give you one quick summary. So Sandy Cole out of Indiana did a study a couple of years ago where they looked at the long-term outcomes of their I-STEP, which would be like our M-STEP. And what they did is they took, they ended up with 1,600 students with IEPs, and they put them into two groups. They had students that had received 80% or more of their instruction inside of general education, and those students who received less than 80% of their instruction in general education. And then they matched these two groups of students on 7 or 8 domains. So they were evenly matched for types of disabilities. They were evenly matched for rate of behavior referrals and suspension expulsion, free and reduced lunch, like all of racial and gender and all of those different pieces, they were matched very evenly. And then they tracked these students' performance on the I-STEP from 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, all the way to 8th grade. And when they looked at the difference, there was a statistically significant difference in outcomes on the ELA and math assessments on all grades, from the students that were 80% of their time in general ed, receiving most of their instruction there, and students who were less than 80% in general education. And so the conclusion of the study was very compelling, and it said that more students should be and could be inside of general education instruction more than currently are. And the other conclusion is that it's challenging our decision making around how we are determining the time spent in general ed versus time spent in pull-out types of settings. So, very exciting. A couple other things to mention on this slide is that one of the other things that we have learned from research, and it's a little bit contrary to kind of like logic, but when students with disabilities are inside of that general education classroom, we also see benefits for the other students. We see neutral or positive impact on academics, on social behavioral domain. We see more acceptance of differences. We see less pitying and like patronizing kinds of behavior. And who couldn't use more of all those things right now in our world, right? And then lastly, time spent in general education is one of the top predictors of post-school outcomes in terms of post-school education, employment, and independent living. So research is very clear that more inclusive practices for all students, but especially for students with disabilities in this case, matter. It impacts lifelong outcomes. All right, and at its core, when we think about inclusion, what do we do for people that we value? You know, what do we do for people that we really value and support in a school? We let them know. They can tell that we matter. It's in our interactions with them, right? And everyone wants to belong. Everyone wants to be a part of something. Everyone wants to feel supported and have opportunities. And sometimes for students with disabilities, we're making those decisions for them. We're determining where their opportunities can occur. We're setting the stage for whether they feel valued and loved and appreciated. And that's not okay. Even students with disabilities want to be a valued member of their community, right? They are people with the same thoughts and feelings and needs that as anyone without a disability. And so I love that now we're starting to see so much more valuing of diversity and celebrating that diversity and moving away from the fixing. So everyone wants this piece. And this is and again, if you were with me, so pay no attention to the QR code. I don't think it will take you anywhere, but you can try it. This continuum, we often ask people to think about your current setup in your district or your current practices. And it starts with, exclusion, which if you think back, years ago, this was our model. I think about the Forrest Gump movie, for those of you who remember that. And Sally Field takes, Forrest into the office because she wants him to be in school. And that principal holds up that piece of paper and has a line across it. And Forrest's, IQ is less than the line. And so he can't come to school. And that's what we did back in the day. So that's that end of the continuum. Shelley Moore is the person who created this continuum. She has a YouTube channel called 5 More Minutes with Shelley Moore. It is phenomenal. She is such an advocate of diversity on many domains, many different identities, and she created this. So in her description, she calls what's typical green. People are green if they're really typical. So you can see here, all the green dots are inside the circle and all the diversity is outside of the circle with the exclusion. And then we have, segregation where, okay, you're not excluded, but you're not in with everyone else. And then integration where you're in with everyone else, but you're kind of like in your own bubble inside of everyone. And then inclusion where, okay, we've got everyone kind of mixed in here. And then lastly, kind of the goal is just teaching to diversity. So here we would just ask you to think about where are you on this continuum in terms of where your district really kind of is in terms of programming or practices. And then thinking about our goal to keep moving to the right. Okay, so we're going to talk really quickly about two main rationale why students are excluded from general ed or restricted in more restricted settings. And rationale one usually is academics. the student is unable to demonstrate the same academic skill level as the others in that grade, for example. And so I want to go back again to what our obligation is per FAPE and the LRE. And one of them is that the supplementary aids and services, that purpose is to support students with disabilities to be active participants inside of general education with their non-disabled peers. And so we're using those supplementary aids and services to think about what are the modifications to the general curriculum, to the activities and the work, the curricular work that we can do so that that student can engage with it. So I think we're past the day, and this is a real example that I saw. I think we're past the day where you know, 6th grade student is allowed in science, but they're going to sit in the back corner and like do a bunny color worksheet. So they're there like physically, but they're not engaged with what the others are doing. And you know what? No 6th grader is going to want to sit back in the room and color when the rest of the 6th graders are engaged in science. So it's how can we allow that student to engage in what the other students are doing in a way that sets them up to be successful. Just like my Foaling example. So the rule is really clear here too, if you look at the blue font, that we have those supplementary aids and services that include modification, and that a child with a disability is not removed from education in age-appropriate regular classrooms solely because they need modification of the curriculum. So that is one place that is very clear that we need to do some of those differentiations. And so some of you are familiar with the instructional unit, very much the universal design for learning. And so again, when we look at that definition of specially designed instruction, sometimes people will say, well, we can't modify because we have to do specially designed instruction. And right in here, it's about adapting the content, the methodology, or the delivery of instruction. So we could think about, how is the student taking in the information? What are different ways that we can support how they're taking it in that still allows them to engage? How might we do different things to allow them to make sense or process the information via activities, via just their own thinking? And how can we make modifications to the output, or how they're going to show us what they know? I'm thinking of a student who was a middle school student, and on his benchmark reading assessment, he was showing that his reading skills were around a 1st grade level. And so everyone was like, well, he doesn't belong in 7th grade. We need to have a change of placement for him. And when we found that when he was reading something at his high interest level, which was city planning and bus routes and subways and things like that, he actually was able to read at a high school level. So he just wasn't showing us what he knew because of his autism, but he had that skill. And so we didn't need to go teach him reading. We needed to have a different way for him to show us what he knows. Okay, so with that, in START, we have a body of work that is around differentiation and how to increase student engagement in the general education classroom with differentiated output. So we talk about the difference between accommodation, which doesn't have a different goal, or students aren't doing something in a different way, but more about modification. And I want to call out Fraser High School for an example. Ryan Sines is the principal there, and we in START have had him present with us before. He has done a phenomenal job, he and his staff, at creating a situation in which there is differentiated tests, for example, tests and quizzes for many of their high school classes. And he has created situations where general education and special education come together and create those. So I want to show you what some of this differentiation can look like on this little video. And I want you to see, before we start, that there's going to be like 5 levels of differentiation. So you wouldn't do the same thing for the same student. You wouldn't do all of these, but it's just modeling for you the different ways. So you're going to see some outlining, some color coding, and you're going to see that it's differentiated down to a yes, no. All right, we can go ahead and play that. There's no sound on this, so I'm going to highlight a few things. So this is calculating the length of each triangle, side of each triangle using the Pythagorean theorem. So here she first, like, we're going to put the formula up there. Student's still going to have to calculate it, but we put the formula. Now she's doing some color coding to help give some visual organization to what should be happening as you're trying to solve this. Now she's adding some color coding to give a little more information. Student's going to pull down the A, pull down the B. She's helping scaffold that. And now she's moving into multiple choice. So is this 3.7 or 4.1? And now she's turning it into, it's 3.7, is it a yes or no? So that is a great example of how we can differentiate the assignment. The student has the same thing, the same materials as everyone else in the room, and they can engage in it in a way that they're on task, they're learning, and most importantly, again, engaged. So you can see the START website and go to the differentiated output hierarchy and learn much more about that. There's more videos and more information. Okay, and then the last thing related to students being excluded because of their academic skills may not be at grade level. Without having a lot of time to go into this whole case, there was a Sixth Circuit case called Hamilton, LH versus Hamilton. Sixth Circuit this case was out of Tennessee, but it's Sixth Circuit, which we are in the Sixth Circuit. So that means decisions that come out of the Sixth Circuit they function as case law for us. And in just a really short summary, this was a student who had Down syndrome, who was attending kindergarten and first grade and a second year of first grade in his home school with his peers in regular education for the bulk of the day. And then as he moved into second grade, the school really felt like he needed to move to a more self-contained program in a different school. And so the parents filed a complaint and they went through that process. So he was in second grade at the time. While this was going through the court system, they had pulled him out and put him in a Montessori private school. And by the time this reached the Sixth Circuit in August of 2018, the student was in high school. And so, again, long story short, one of the most compelling reasons for thinking differently about the academic as rationale for exclusion is this statement that I highlighted here. This is language from the court case, from the decision. So they say, what the IDEA implies, case law makes explicit. A child need not master the general education curriculum for inclusion to remain a viable option. The appropriate yardstick is whether the child, here we go again, with the appropriate supplemental aids and services, can make progress toward the IEP goals in that regular ed setting. And so, again, this is on top of the IDEA language. Now we have case law saying we don't have to master the curriculum in order to be a part of it. I don't have to master that football throw in order to go bowling, okay? I can still engage. And we saw that we are required to consider modifications in order to create that engagement. Okay. The second rationale why students are pulled from or restricted from general education, I'm sure you're saying this in your head, is behavior. And so there are a lot of resources that you can access that I do believe I put on the resource document in your Dropbox folder. This could be a full day training in itself. So basically, IDEA requirements are that we have to consider the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports when a student with an IEP has behavior that is impeding his learning or the learning of others. And we know that there are times where conducting a functional behavior assessment and developing a behavior intervention plan are required. Okay, so another Dear Colleague letter, which again, these come out of the Federal Office of Special Education Programs, says this related to behavior. Placement teams may not place a child with a disability in special classes, separate schooling, or other restricted settings outside of that regular environment solely due to behavior when behavior supports to the provision of supplementary aids and services could be provided that would be effective in addressing behavior. Again, sounds very much like the LRE language that we just read. So basically FAPE and LRE also apply when we have students with disabilities with behavior. Okay, I think one of the best resources to point you to came out of, again, the U.S. Department of Ed, Office of Special Education and Rehab Services this summer. One is an updated Q&A document on addressing the needs of students with IEPs with discipline provisions. And the other one is a very well done, positive, proactive approaches to supporting students with disabilities. And so, interestingly enough, and I hope this gives you some comfort, the positive, proactive approaches should look really familiar to you. So, culturally and linguistically responsive MTSS is a comprehensive prevention framework designed to improve developmental, social, emotional, academic, and behavioral outcomes using that continuum of evidence-based strategies and supports. And they give some examples here at each tier. And you could layer on some more things. So, what we're doing for all students by having this well-developed MTSS framework with these different interventions and resources and all of that can be intensified, can be applied to students with disabilities that are displaying behavior. And our own Michigan Model Code of Student Conduct, which was revamped in 2019, gives a really nice description of why so much emphasis on behavior supports and why does it matter? Well, again, we know that we have exclusionary discipline happening. It sets the stage for students being disenfranchised with school, for academic failure, for dropout, and the potential for criminalization. And we know this is the part that is we have to be so aware of, is that this exclusionary discipline that has those types of outcomes is disproportionately applied to students of color, students with disabilities, and low-income students. Okay, so what do we do? I'm gonna spend the rest of the time talking about strategies and what do we do. And again, thinking back to those positive, proactive strategies and everything that we know about foundational practices such as PBIS, first thing is, in your general ed classroom, in a special education classroom, in any setting in which any student is in, any setting in which a student with a disability is in, are these big ideas of school-wide PBIS in place with fidelity? So kind of think about this as I go through as a checklist. Like, in our school, have we identified and defined behavior expectations? Have we taught those? Do we monitor those and give feedback? Are we acknowledging when kids are doing and showing and demonstrating what we've been teaching with those expectations? Are we reteaching and responding with instruction to students who are still not displaying those behaviors? And are we using data for decision making versus our own thinking and feeling, which around behavior can, not always be the most thoughtful? Okay, so then the next layer would be, now that we've talked about school-wide, do we have foundations of effective classroom practices in place? So is our design of the physical environment of the class set up for active engagement in instruction? Can you walk around the classroom and actively monitor and supervise and give feedback easily? Or are there places where you get stuck or trapped or you can't get to certain students because of the physical environment? Are there some hidden areas that you can't see what's happening in that corner at all? And can you get to every student within 1 or 2 seconds? Have you posted, in the classroom, do we have expectations that are the same as the school-wide expectations, but are tailored to your classroom? And do you have routines and procedures that are practiced and taught? So a student who has a lot of behavioral challenges, for example, when they come into that classroom, is it really clear what the routine is? Have they practiced it? Do they know it? Because that provides that consistent, safe, predictable environment that right away can reduce behavior in many students. So again, have we taught and practiced those routines? All right, the next layer, so school-wide, classroom. Now, are we using high-yield strategies? Are we using those things that are the big bang for the buck, that are really rooted in solid research, that seem deceptively simple, but matter so much? And that is the positive greeting at the door. You know, are we using the student's name? Are we glad to see them? Are we making them feel special? Are we kind of reading the room when they walk in a little bit as we're greeting them and setting ourselves up to know that maybe the student needs a little more support today? Are we using active engagement strategies like opportunities to respond, which many times people have said, well, for students with disabilities or who are reluctant learners, that seems like it puts a lot of pressure on them. When opportunities to respond can really be set up in a way to be safe for students who are reluctant learners and can actually allow them to have more practice opportunities. I might partner, be really strategic with some partner share and make sure that a student I know does not want to share out is partnered with someone who will have a really great idea, and maybe the student will be willing to share it. Or they get to share the glory in their partner sharing the really good idea because they're partners. And lastly, are we using a positive interaction ratio? So we talk a lot about the 5 positive interactions to every 1 corrective interaction. When we're talking about students with disabilities, we need to have that be more like 9 to 1 or 10 to 1. And we would add not just 9 or 10 to 1 positives to every corrective, but to every corrective, prompt, help, or demand. Because students with disabilities often spend most of their day being prompted, being corrected, given demands, stop this, do this, and those can feel really negative, even when they're well-intended and necessary in some respects. So we have to have that higher ratio to kind of offset that. One document I would really suggest that you pull is on the pbis.org site, is this one, and it outlines, I kind of call this the top 10 strategies. It outlines all of those strategies we just talked about, and how that implementing these, again, can be very supportive of students with IEPs with disabilities. Okay, one of the things that we can do actionably is to begin to change our beliefs. So we have 13 actually mantras in START or START isms, and I just put a couple here for us to think about in terms of challenging our beliefs. So presume competence. This means believing that a person has the capacity to understand and learn, regardless of whether or not we have evidence of it. Just like the student I talked about, we had no evidence that he was reading at the high school level. Our evidence showed he was reading more at a first grade level. However, we learned really acutely that he had a very strong reading level, and we need to presume competence. How we think about a student's capabilities impacts the decisions we make. And I hope that feels heady, because that is a big call. Low expectations lead to minimal results. When you aim high, presume competence, students rise to meet those expectations. And we have to operate under the least dangerous assumption. What if I assume that you can't learn, and so I don't teach you at the level that you should be taught? And I find out later that you could learn. That gives me goosebumps. But what if I presume you can learn, and I teach you, and I find out you can't, or you couldn't learn at the same level? We've provided and engaged in much more learning than would have happened otherwise. All right, so the other one to begin to change beliefs is peer-to-peer isn't one more thing, it is the thing. If you could choose just one evidence-based practice for students with autism, I would argue other students as well, that would have a far-reaching effect on the quality of life of all students, it's peer-to-peer. It's not just an evidence-based practice, which it is the #1 evidence-based practice for supporting students with autism. It's a way of being together that promotes belonging and friendship and connection and a shared experience. And there's not much else that does that for peers. And this is not a helping model. This is not where I'm going to have, pair up this student with a student with an IEP, and they're going to be like a little mini parapro. and help them. No, this is a participation model. They're going to be with them. They're going to learn about friends and building relationships from the natural environment. And the last STARTism is inclusion is not a readiness model. So again, first and foremost, students with disabilities are general education students. They don't have to earn their way into class. They don't have to reach a certain skill level to engage, just like I didn't have to show competency with football throwing to play that foaling game, right? They're there, and we provide the supports that are necessary. Okay. The next action step is to begin to change our language. So instead of saying things like, oh, well, he's just not ready for gen ed, let's flip our thinking and say, well, how do we get this general ed classroom ready for him, right? That's a change in perspective, and it allows us to problem solve in a different way. Instead of saying this strategy didn't work, Paula Kluth, who is an amazing teacher, speaker on inclusion, says, you know what, when someone says the strategy doesn't work, I propose that we find 20 ways it will. And so I think let's just find 2 or 3. Let's start there. So if someone says the strategy didn't work, let's say, well, you know what, let's sit down, let's problem solve, let's find 2 or 3 ways that it will. Instead of saying he doesn't belong here, he doesn't have XYZ to be ready to be in here, he doesn't belong here. We can say, how do we make sure he has a sense of belonging here? So if you have a student who's not in that gen ed classroom all day, when they are in your general ed classroom, do they have a name tag on their desk like other students? Is their name on the birthday, bulletin board? Do they know you're their teacher? If someone said, who's your teacher, would they say Mrs. Dyer? Or would they go, because they have several, right? Do they know that that's their classroom? Those are their peers. And that, again, fosters belonging. Another action step is to layer on some universal supports that we started with at the beginning of this session. These are founded in the evidence-based practices. These are all listed on that tool, that C2R that I mentioned, that's in your Dropbox resource. And these are things that do move the dial for students. When these are in those supplementary aids and services and we are acting upon implementing these things, these move the dial for students and increase engagement, increase independence, and build skills. So I'm going to go through some of these really quickly just for the little bit of time that we have left to give you a flavor, and you know many of them. And again, you can find out more information about each of these on the START website. But we know students with autism, but many, many other students benefit from having visual supports. And you might say, well, a visual schedule, for example, they know their schedule. But if you find yourself answering the same questions from students, like what time is lunch? When is lunch? Is it almost lunch? Again, if you have a visual showing your schedule, you can be like, it's right there. Now that student can reduce their anxiety and not have to think about it anymore because they know it's there. Words are said and spoken and gone, poof. Visuals stay there. We can come back to them, we can refer to them. And I know that many of you that are watching use visuals. We write things down, we cross things off. We have traffic lights that tell us information about when to go and when to stop. We have lines, we have color coding things everywhere. They all help give us information, and we find them helpful. If you are a student with autism or other diverse learning needs and you need that, we need to provide that. They help everyone. So we have another mantra in START that says these practices are essential, they're effective for all students, but they're essential for some students. We also have scientific reason why visuals work really well for students with autism. And this study actually looked at brain tissue of persons with autism who had passed away and found that in all of the different parts of the brain that were sampled, the visual cortex was the only place that was developing typically. So we can use the strength of the brain and provide those visuals and kind of match the neurobiology. All right, functional communication. Functional communication is often just missed. And I want you to think about this. Functional communicators can communicate what they want, when they want, to whoever they want, using a system they want, whenever they want to fulfill the purposes that they need, right? You and I communicate, probably most everyone on this call communicates fairly effectively and can get their needs met without engaging in behavior. We see students that engage in behavior, and again, remember, behavior is communication. If I am unable to get my needs met with words, or if I'm not able to use verbal behavior, or I don't have a system of anything to touch, to point, to show you what I want, I'm going to engage in behavior because I have an unmet need that I need to let you know about. And so having functional communication improves and increases independence and engagement and all those wonderful things that we're trying to instill in students. So if you look at this Communication Bill of Rights, and I just pulled off these 15 items on this slide, what I do with more time is I would have you look at this and think about if I only asked you to pick 3 of these rights, you could only have 3 of these rights. Which 3 would you pick? You know, do you want the right to request things? Do you want the right to refuse undesired objects, actions, events, or people? Do you want the right to make comments and share your opinion? If you want those 3, then you have to let go of everything else, right? And what I find is that nobody wants to let go of any of these. Yet we have students that we are making communication assumptions for them. Oh, look at Trey. I know Trey's hungry right now. Trey wants a snack and he really likes crackers, so let's give Trey a snack. Let's give Trey crackers. And then Trey, throws the crackers. He doesn't want them. He's protesting, and then he's in trouble. But he has no other way to say, no, thank you. I don't want those right now. So again, behavior is communication. In an absence of functional communication, we can see escalation of behavior. So I always talk about a student, a second grade student named Mitchell, who was incredibly verbal, one of the brightest kids I've ever met. And when he was in kindergarten, he used to tell me that he was smarter than me, and I would always say, I know you are, because he was. But one day, my colleague walks in the office of the school, and the custodian was talking to Mitchell, and Mitchell was very upset and kind of yelling back, and apparently that he had put like fingerprints all over the front window and had like thrown some things off the secretary desk and stuff. And so this exchange is happening, this yelling and all of this. And my colleague walks in and she picked up a Post-it note and she said, when you put fingerprints on the windows, you have to clean them, which is what the custodian was trying to get him to do. And so he just said, with a swear word that I won't say, but why didn't somebody just tell me that? So it was a highly verbal kid, but in that escalation, he was not able to communicate effectively. And so we gave him a yes, no, and a please back away card. So when he was escalated like that, he could at least respond in a way that let his voice be heard. Okay, peer-to-peer, we talked briefly about that. That is another evidence-based practice. If you are on the START website, and you can find this article from some of my colleagues in conjunction with Eric Carter from Vanderbilt, wrote up some of the outcomes that we're seeing in peer-to-peer programs across the state, and not just for the student with a disability. We are seeing outcomes for the students who are serving as links or peer-to-peer, participating in peer-to-peer. And we are seeing things like increased attendance for those students who are being a link. We're seeing increased GPA. We're seeing decreased behavior referrals. And in some places, we have districts that are using peer-to-peer as an intervention for a student who is having attendance issues or showing some behavior. And those students are benefiting as well from peer-to-peer in really big ways. So that's really exciting. Another one of these universal supports is our use of adults, our use of parapros, and how we are setting them up or not setting them up to understand what their role is. So in my experience, having worked with a lot of schools and districts and ISDs and paraprofessionals over the years, is we do not do a very good job of helping them understand what their role is. And in absence of that, they presume that their role is to keep kids quiet and keep behavior managed. And so We talk about having parapros, understand about presuming competence, and that independence and social competency only develop with opportunities to be independent and engage socially. And so adults then become the facilitators of independence and social opportunity rather than behavior managers. And so in that C to R tool I mentioned, these are the 4 items that are in there with further description to help kind of change the interactions around adults and students. And so we also use a tool to help think about when does a student actually need an adult and for what purpose. So it might be that in science class, that adult is making sure that that student has their differentiated lab sheet and then is standing back and only intervening if she needs to prompt that student in some way, socially or whatever. Otherwise, she's there, she's prompting them to their tools, but staying out of the way of the social opportunities that are happening, etc. And then the last universal support that we're going to talk about right now is behavior support plans, so PBIS. And so it should be no surprise that we should be informing these based on a solid foundation of Tier 1 implementation of these universal supports that I just mentioned. We want to emphasize and make sure that our behavior support plans have an emphasis on prevention and antecedent interventions, that we have pieces in that behavior plan that are about teaching and reteaching skill, that we are responding to behaviors through reinforcement of the things that we're wanting to see more of, and that we're correcting behavior through reteaching, and that we're considering function and matching our strategies to the function of the behavior. So again, all of these things I mentioned are effective for all students, but they're really essential for many students with disabilities. And they can serve as those supplementary aids and services that move the dial for students, that allow them more access to and progress in gen ed. Okay, and one of the things I just want to leave you with as a resource, and again, we have more information about this on the START website, but it's when we're talking about behavior support plans, in order to help them be better implemented and more clear, we engage in behavior scripts. And so this is just an example of how we might set this up, but not every student, necessarily has all 6 levels of escalation here or whatever. But we always want to think about, what does the student look like when they're calm and engaged in the task? What do they look like? What do we see them look like? And then what are we going to do to keep them there? So we write little scripts about the 9 to 1 or the 5 to 1, the reinforcements, things like that. What might we say and do to keep them there? And then when we start to see a little disengagement, what does that student look like? What does your student look like when they start to just get a little bit disengaged? You're like, something might be happening here. What do we say and do when we see that happening? And we do that through kind of the whole progression. So again, we have more information on the START website, but just I wanted to just kind of prime your brain to think about behavior plans in a way that's kind of scripted. Okay, and then I'm just going to leave you our final comment is I just want to leave you with a strategy for shifting thinking. So my colleague and I have been talking about Path A and Path B for a long time, and there's something about behavior where we naturally kind of go down Path B, where we kind of blame the student, we want to fix the student, and we tend to respond to behavior in a more punitive way. As opposed to thinking about Path A, which is, what's the context, what's going on, what's in the environment that's continuing to support that behavior's, to maintain that behavior. What intervention plan can we put into place that's supportive of the student and not punitive? And so, again, when we have been learning more about some of the work around vulnerable decision points, this is really kind of what we're talking about here. When our emotions are high and we're getting ready to respond to a student in that reactive emotional way, this idea of Path A, Path B can kind of neutralize our emotions. So we talk about, for teams, when we're coming together and we're all revved up because a student engaged in a big behavior and we're starting to blame and we're starting to think about punitive strategies, we teach the coaches to go, we're going down Path B, we need to shift. And we shift over to Path A. Now, what about what is happening? how can we support this? So we had a student, for example, who was 6, who was very, very passionate about dinosaurs, wanted to be a paleontologist. I got a call from the principal because he came to school, and she said he engaged in property destruction and sexual harassment, and was very revved up, and the team was very revved up. And what had actually happened is that he could make anything a dinosaur. So he had been taking scissors, and he was walking around the room, and he snipped the teacher's plant on her desk, and he snipped the pull-down screen, like about 1/4 inch. And then the sexual harassment was he wore dinosaur everything, sweatshirts, hats, shirts, everything he could was dinosaurs. And so one day he had new dinosaur underwear on, and he pulled it down to show his friends. And so they were there was a really good team, and they really understood autism, but there was something about this that really got them, I think, scared and worried, and they were going down path B. And so we recognized that it was going down path B, and nothing good for anyone was going to come of going down path B and referring to the student as having engaged in property destruction and sexual harassment when they're 6. That's going to stick with them. We all know that, right? And so it was shifting it to path A. Okay, this stuff happened. We know he's being driven by his love and passion of his high interest in dinosaurs, but he can't just cut anything, right? And he doesn't understand the rules about what clothing he can show and what he can't. So strategies were put into place about when and where it was okay for dinosaurs, and what clothes were okay to share, and what things stayed private and didn't get shared at school. And so it went from a supportive teaching kind of path as opposed to that punitive response. So that is a strategy that may help you as you're really problem solving around some students. Okay, with that, we are out of time, and so I hope that this has been helpful. I hope it has triggered some thinking about some great strategies you can consider, and hopefully thinking differently about the idea of having students inside of general ed more than maybe currently happening in your world. Thank you.